Okay, we've come to chapter 41 of the book of Genesis, and it's the continuation of the story of Joseph here. And we're going to read, first of all, chapter 41, verses 1 to 8, which says this: After 2 whole years, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing by the Nile, and behold, there came up out of the Nile 7 cows, sleek and fat, and they fed in the reed grass. And behold, 7 other cows, gaunt and thin, came up out of the Nile after them, and stood by the other cows on the bank of the Nile. And the gaunt and thin cows ate up the 7 sleek and fat cows. And Pharaoh awoke, and he fell asleep, and dreamed a second time. And behold, 7 ears of grain, plump and good, were growing on one stalk. And behold, after them sprouted 7 ears, thin and blighted by the east wind. And the thin ears swallowed up the 7 plump and full ears. And Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream. So in the morning his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. And Pharaoh told them his dream, but there was none who could interpret it to Pharaoh. 2 years have elapsed then since the end of chapter 40. We saw in chapter 40 how Joseph was still in prison, and how the baker and the butler or the cupbearer had joined him in prison. They had experienced dreams which Joseph had interpreted and which had come to fulfillment. And so we have this gap of 2 years, and after 2 years have elapsed, one night Pharaoh had 2 dreams in quick succession. In his first dream, he was standing by the Nile when 7 sleek and fat cows came up out of the Nile to feed upon the reed grass. And they were followed then by 7 gaunt and thin cows that also came up out of the Nile. And those 7 thin cows ate up the 7 sleek and fat cows. Egypt was dependent upon the river Nile. The annual flooding of the Nile brought fertility to the land, and the area of land on either side of the Nile was very fertile. Every year when the Nile flooded, it would leave behind it this rich soil, this silt on which they could grow their crops. So these cows coming up out of the Nile suggest emphasize really the importance of the river Nile for the economy of Egypt. So they were dependent on the Nile for their food and for their prosperity. So after he has this first dream, then Pharaoh woke up, and then he fell asleep again, and he had a second dream. And in the second dream he saw these 7 plump and good ears of grain, which were all growing on one stalk, and 7 thin ears of grain, blighted by the east wind, sprouted up after them. The 7 thin ears swallowed up the 7 plump and full ears. We notice here that these 7 thin ears were blighted by the east wind, and it always seemed that it was the east wind that brought disaster upon people. So we later see in Exodus chapter 10 and verse 13, with the plague of locusts that came upon Egypt in the time of Moses. They were brought by an east wind. Exodus chapter 10 verse 13 says, So Moses stretched forth his rod over the land of Egypt, and the Lord brought an east wind upon the land all that day and all that night. And when it was morning, the east wind had brought the locusts. And then in the prophet Ezekiel chapter 17 and verse 10, we see another east wind here. Ezekiel 17 verse 10, which is an allegory, sort of parable that Ezekiel is being shown concerning a vine, the growing of a vine. Exodus 17 verse 10 says, Behold, when it is transplanted, will it thrive? Will this vine thrive when it's transplanted? Will it not utterly wither when the east wind strikes it, wither away on the bed where it grows? And the east wind mentioned there, the wind coming from the east, which would cause the vine to wither away. In the prophet Jonah chapter 4, I'll go to Hosea. There's Hosea chapter 13 verse 15, Hosea chapter 13 verse 15 also mentions the east wind. Though he may flourish, this is talking about Israel or Ephraim, though he may flourish as the reed plant, the east wind, the wind of the Lord shall come, rising from the wilderness, and his fountain shall dry up, his spring shall be parched, it shall strip his treasury of every precious thing. So again, the east wind coming and causing destruction or problems for Israel is being pictured then. It's described there as the wind of the Lord coming from the wilderness. And then in the prophet Jonah, Jonah chapter 4 verse 8, when Jonah is outside of the city of Nineveh waiting to see what will happen, said, when the sun rose, God appointed a sultry east wind, and the sun beat upon the head of Jonah, so that he was faint, and he asked that he might die. Said, it is better for me to die than to live. So an east wind causing Jonah problems as well. So in this dream Pharaoh has, he sees these 7 thin ears of grain which have been blighted by the east wind, the wind coming from the east and destroying them really. So Pharaoh awoke then after his second dream, and realizing it was all a dream, and in the morning, when he got up in the morning, his spirit was troubled by the dreams that he had experienced. So he called in the magicians and wise men of Egypt. These were important figures in the royal court. They were men who were supposedly skilled in the interpretation of dreams. We find a similar group in the time of Moses as well, in Exodus chapter 7 verse 11, when Moses and Aaron go in to see Pharaoh on this occasion, and Pharaoh's rod turns into a serpent. So Exodus chapter 7 verse 11 says, then Pharaoh summoned the wise men and the sorcerers, and they also, the magicians of Egypt, did the same by their secret art. So again, these are an important class of people who are the advisors and the helpers to the pharaohs. We see also a similar group in the time of Daniel in Babylon, in the court of King Nebuchadnezzar, in Daniel chapter 1 and verse 20. Daniel chapter 1 verse 20, after Daniel and his 3 friends, Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, have been declining the king's rich food and just eating the water and vegetables, and they are assessed, and chapter 1 verse 20 says of them, in every matter of wisdom and understanding concerning which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in all his kingdom. So again, their mention of those magicians and enchanters in Nebuchadnezzar's time in Babylon. And in chapter 2 verse 2 of Daniel as well, Nebuchadnezzar has a dream in this chapter, and he calls in his magicians and sorcerers as well to try and interpret it. Then the king commanded that the magicians, the enchanters, the sorcerers and the Chaldeans be summoned to tell the king his dreams. So they came in and stood before the king. So the same sort of thing is happening here in Genesis with Pharaoh. After he's had these dreams, he calls in these men who are supposedly able to interpret the dream for him and tell him what it means. But in this case, none of them were able to do so, to tell him the meanings. Verse 8 concludes there, Pharaoh told them his dream, but there was none who could interpret it to Pharaoh. We move on here to verses 9 to 13, which goes on to say, then the chief butler said to Pharaoh, I remember my faults today, when Pharaoh was angry with his servants and put me and the chief baker in custody in the house of the captain of the guard. We dreamed on the same night, he and I, each having a dream with its own meaning. A young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. And when we told him, he interpreted our dreams to us, giving an interpretation to each man according to his dream. And as he interpreted to us, so it came to pass. I was restored to my office, and the baker was hanged. So when the magicians and the wise men had failed to give Pharaoh an interpretation of his dreams, the chief butler, the cupbearer, says he remembered his faults and the things that had happened in the prison 2 years earlier. He's referring back here to chapter 40, verse 14, when Joseph has interpreted his dream that he would be restored to his position. Joseph had said to him, "But remember me when it is well with you, and do me the kindness, I pray you, to make mention of me to Pharaoh, and so get me out of this house." But the last verse of chapter 40 says, "Yet the chief butler did not remember Joseph, but forgot him." So after he had been released, the chief butler forgot all about Joseph, or put him out of his mind. And so he's recalling here now the experience of Pharaoh with his dreams has sort of triggered off these memories for the butler, and he recalls how he and the chief baker had been put in the prison, how they had both had their dreams, which had been interpreted by a young Hebrew, he describes Joseph as, and how the interpretations had been fulfilled, that the butler was restored to his office whilst the baker was hanged, being put to death. So following on from that, then the Pharaoh then was anxious to summon Joseph. So we read in chapter 41 from verse 14, "Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they brought him hastily out of the dungeon. And when he had shaved himself and changed his clothes, he came in before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it. And I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. Joseph answered Pharaoh, It is not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, Behold, in my dream I was standing on the banks of the Nile, and 7 cows, fat and sleek, came up out of the Nile and fed in the reed grass. And 7 other cows came up after them, poor and very gaunt and thin, such as I had never seen in all the land of Egypt. And the thin and gaunt cows ate up the first 7 fat cows. But when they had eaten them, no one would have known that they had eaten them, for they were still as gaunt as at the beginning. Then I awoke. I also saw in my dream 7 ears growing on one stalk, full and good, and 7 ears, withered, thin, and blighted by the east wind, sprouted after them. And the thin ears swallowed up the 7 good ears. And I told it to the magicians, but there was no one who could explain it to me. So having heard the butler's account, his testimony, Pharaoh then immediately sent for Joseph. So he was brought hastily out of the dungeon. He shaved himself, for Egyptians were clean shaven, and he changed his clothes before coming into the presence of Pharaoh, no doubt wanting to look his best, to look respectable for this audience with Pharaoh. And Pharaoh announced to Joseph that he had had a dream, which no one had been able to interpret, and he has heard that Joseph is able to interpret dreams. Well, Joseph denied that the ability to interpret is in him. The power is not his, but it is God's. Again, this goes back to chapter 40 and verse 8, when the butler and the baker had had their dreams in the prison. They said to Joseph, We have had dreams and there is no one to interpret them. Joseph said to them, Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell them to me, I pray. So Joseph recognized that he didn't have the power to do this. The power to give an interpretation came from God. Daniel also acknowledged that in his experience with Nebuchadnezzar, in Daniel chapter 2, from verse 25, after Nebuchadnezzar has had his dream, which we mentioned earlier. Chapter 2, verse 25 is when Daniel is brought in before the king. Daniel, the king says to Daniel in verse 26, Are you able to make known to me the dream that I have seen and its interpretation? Daniel answered the king, No wise men, enchanters, magicians, or astrologers can show to the king the mystery which the king has asked. but there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days. So the same in Daniel's case as well. Both Joseph and Daniel acknowledge that the power isn't in them, but the power to interpret these dreams comes from God. It's God who gives that interpretation. So Joseph is not seeking any credit or any recognition for himself. And he says that it is God who will give a favorable answer, or the Authorized Version translates that God will give an answer of peace. And the Hebrew word there is that word shalom, that translated as a favorable answer or an answer of peace. So God will give him a good answer. So Pharaoh then relates his dream to Joseph. Some details are added here to the earlier account we had of the dreams. Pharaoh says that he had never seen such thin and gaunt cows in the land of Egypt before, as he saw in this dream. And also he says that when the 7 thin cows had eaten up the 7 fat cows, no one would have known it, because the 7 thin ones were just the same. They were no fatter, still as gaunt and thin as they were at the beginning. It made no difference. So this was the dream, and as Pharaoh says that his magicians could not explain it to him. So Joseph now has the opportunity to interpret or give God's interpretation of the dream for Pharaoh. So we'll read on here, verse 25 to 36. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, "The dream of Pharaoh is one. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good ears are 7 years. The dream is one. The 7 lean and gaunt cows that came up after them are 7 years, and the 7 empty ears, blighted by the east wind, are also 7 years of famine. It is as I told Pharaoh. God has shown to Pharaoh what he is about to do. There will come 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt, but after them there will arise 7 years of famine, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt. The famine will consume the land, and the plenty will be unknown in the land by reason of that famine which will follow, for it will be very grievous. And the doubling of Pharaoh's dream means that the thing is fixed by God, and God will shortly bring it to pass. Now therefore let Pharaoh select a man discreet and wise, and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh proceed to appoint overseers over the land, and take the 5th part of the produce of the land of Egypt during the 7 plenteous years. And let them gather all the food of these good years that are coming, and lay up grain under the authority of Pharaoh for food in the cities, and let them keep it. That food shall be a reserve for the land against the 7 years of famine which are to befall the land of Egypt, so that the land may not perish through famine." When Joseph begins to speak, then he tells Pharaoh that the dream is one, and God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The dream concerns the immediate future, something that will soon happen. The 7 good cows represent 7 good years, and the 7 good ears of grain are also 7 years. And although Pharaoh's experienced 2 dreams, or 2 parts to the dream, the message of the 2 dreams is one, so it has a single meaning. The 7 thin and gaunt cows are also 7 years, as are the 7 empty ears, and these represent 7 years of famine. So Joseph reaffirms that God is showing Pharaoh what he is about to do, that there will be 7 good years of plentiful harvests throughout the land of Egypt, but these will be followed by 7 years of famine, which will consume the land of Egypt, and the years of plenty will then soon be forgotten. And Joseph says the famine will be very grievous, so a severe famine is going to affect the land of Egypt. And Joseph explains that the doubling of the dream, or its repetition in these 2 forms, means that the thing is fixed by God. So this is certain to happen, and God will soon bring it to pass. And Joseph then goes beyond giving an interpretation of the dream to advising Pharaoh on what he should do. in order to deal with this coming crisis, to alleviate the effects of this. Joseph tells him that he should set a wise and discreet man over the land of Egypt. He should also appoint officers or overseers over the land who would take 1/5 or 20% of the produce of the land during the 7 good years, and this should be stored away for use during the 7 years of famine. And so by making this provision, then the land will not perish during the famine. So it's about being prepared, using the good years as an opportunity to prepare for the bad years that were to come. Reading on in the story here, verses 37 to 45, which goes on to say, this proposal seemed good to Pharaoh and to all his servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find such a man as this, in whom is the Spirit of God? So Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has shown you all this, there is none so discreet and wise as you are. And you shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only as regards the throne will I be greater than you. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, behold, I have set you over all the land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, and arrayed him in garments of fine linen, and put a gold chain about his neck. And he made him to ride in his second chariot. And they cried before him, bow the knee. Thus he set him over all the land of Egypt. Moreover, Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without your consent no man shall lift up hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphenath-Paneah, and he gave him in marriage Asenath, the daughter of Potipharah, a priest of On. So Joseph went out over the land of Egypt. So Pharaoh and his servants recognized that Joseph's proposal, his advice was good advice. It was a good proposal. Pharaoh was impressed by Joseph, and he could see that he would be the right man for the job. And so he asked his servants, can we find such a man as this, in whom is the Spirit of God? So although Pharaoh and the Egyptians worshipped lots of different gods, there is an acknowledgement here of Joseph's God, of the God that Joseph worships, and the Spirit of God dwelling within him. The phrase there, Spirit of God, is the same phrase that is used right at the beginning of the book of Genesis in chapter 1 and verse 2, which speaks of the Spirit of God moving over the face of the waters. And the same thing was said of Daniel as well. We go back to Daniel again and see another similarity here. Daniel chapter 5, verses 11 and 12, which is the story of Belshazzar's feast and the writing on the wall that occurs there, and Daniel being called in to interpret that writing. This is where the queen mother says to the king, there is in your kingdom a man in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. In the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him, and King Nebuchadnezzar your father made him chief of the magicians. So the queen mother there is recommending to Belshazzar so that she call in Daniel, and he's described there as being a man in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. Same sort of phrase that is used here as well. That's a man in whom is the Spirit of God. So Pharaoh recognized Joseph's ability, and he appointed Joseph to this high position in his household and in the land of Egypt, second only to Pharaoh himself. He says here, since God has shown you all this, there is none so discreet and wise as you are. You shall be over my house, and all my people will order themselves as you command. Only as regards the throne will I be greater than you. Behold, I have set you over all the land of Egypt. So this was a similar position to the ones that Joseph has already occupied when he was in Potiphar's house. It was only Potiphar who was above Joseph, and then when Joseph was in the prison, he was running the prison. It was only the captain of the guard who was above him there. So this has moved up a further step now, with only Pharaoh being the one above him. So in recognition of Joseph's promotion, Pharaoh gave to him his signet ring, took that off his own hand and put it on Joseph's hand. And the signet ring was important. It was a symbol of his authority, like the royal seal, be used to seal official documents. He had him dressed in fine linen. Linen was a good quality material produced in Egypt, and he was given a gold chain of office to indicate his authority. We see mayors today who wear those gold chains of office around their neck. So something similar to that sort of situation here, this gold chain put around his neck. And he was to ride in Pharaoh's second chariot. The people were called upon to bow the knee before him, perhaps in fulfillment of Joseph's own dreams back in chapter 37, when he saw his brothers and family bowing down before him in those dreams there. It's the people of Egypt who are to bow before him. So in this way then, Joseph is set over the land of Egypt, and the people were to honor him. Pharaoh delegated great authority to Joseph. He says in verse 44, "I am Pharaoh, and without your consent no man shall lift up hand or foot in all the land of Egypt." So he's given him really a huge amount of authority here in the land. Pharaoh then gave Joseph a new name, an Egyptian name, called him Zaphanath-Paneah. The meaning of that name is unknown. It's probably an Egyptian word, which the meaning of that it hasn't been determined. He's given also a wife who is named Asenath, and her name means belonging to the goddess Neith, and she was the daughter of Potipharah, who is a priest in the city of On. The name Potipharah means he whom the sun god has given, and the city of On is named Heliopolis in the Greek translation of the Old Testament. And that city was a center of the sun god Ra. Joseph elevated to this high position in Egypt. He has a new name, he has a new wife, and all seems to be well for him. So read on here in verses 46 to, we'll read verse 46 to 49. It says, "Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went through all the land of Egypt. During the 7 plenteous years, the earth brought forth abundantly, and he gathered up all the food of the 7 years when there was plenty in the land of Egypt, and stored up food in the cities. He stored up in every city the food from the fields around it. And Joseph stored up grain in great abundance, like the sand of the sea, until he ceased to measure it, for it could not be measured." Joseph was 17 years old when this story began, back in chapter 37 and verse 2. His age is given, there's 17. And now he is 30 years old when he enters the service of Pharaoh. So 13 years have passed here. And now it's a great leap from being a slave and being a prisoner to becoming second in power over the land of Egypt. God has been with Joseph throughout his hardships, and God has brought him to this position. Verse in Isaiah chapter 64 verse 4 says that God works for those who wait for him, and God had worked for Joseph. Joseph set out on a tour of the land of Egypt to make preparations for the coming famine. Joseph's interpretation of Pharaoh's dream came to fulfillment as 7 years of abundant harvest brought forth a plentiful supply of grain. And during these years of plenty, Joseph had the surplus grain stored up in the cities. The abundance of food was such that it is likened to the sand of the sea, and could not be measured. There was so much of it that they just gave up trying to measure it. Well, verses 50 and 52 has some personal details about Joseph now. Before the year of famine came, Joseph had two sons, whom Asenath, the daughter of Potipharah, priest of On, bore to him. Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, for he said, God has made me forget all my hardship and all my father's house. The name of the second he called Ephraim, for God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. So during the years of plenty, Joseph had these two sons born by his wife Asenath, and Joseph's firstborn was given the name Manasseh, which means making to forget, because he explained, God has made me forget all my hardship and all my father's house. So the memories of those harsh times were eased a little by the things that had happened. And his second son was named Ephraim, which means to be fruitful. Again, Joseph explains the name. He says, because God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. So the names are significant. Joseph had enjoyed God's blessings despite all of the afflictions and the hardship that he had suffered in Egypt. And the names of his sons are an indication of Joseph's faith and trust in God and his acknowledgement of the mercies that he has received from God. We move on to the final verse in the chapter, verse 53 to 57, which says, the 7 years of plenty that prevailed in the land of Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began to come, as Joseph had said. There was famine in all lands, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread. When all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread. And Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, go to Joseph, what he says to you do. So when the famine had spread over all the land, Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe in the land of Egypt. Moreover, all the earth came to Egypt to Joseph to buy grain, because the famine was severe over all the earth. So just as Joseph had predicted, the 7 years of plenty eventually came to an end, to be replaced by the 7 years of famine. And the famine affected all of the lands of the region, not just Egypt. But in Egypt there was bread, thanks to the provision that the measures that Joseph had taken. And when the famine began to hit the people there in Egypt, they went to Pharaoh to ask him for bread. And he sent them to Joseph and told them to follow Joseph's instructions. So with the famine affecting all of the land, then Joseph opened up the storehouses where all this grain has been stored during the 7 years of plenty, and he sold it to the Egyptians. It was a severe famine, and people from other lands began to come to Egypt in order to buy grain from Joseph there as well. So it's a famine that has a wide effect, and we will see in the next chapter the effect of that famine that it has upon Joseph's brothers, Jacob, his father Jacob, and the brothers. That the famine affects the land of Canaan as well, and that leads into the next part of the story, which we will be looking at next week. There is a summary of Joseph's experiences during this time in one of the Psalms, Psalm 105. This is a psalm a historical psalm, which recalls many events from the history of Israel. Psalm 105, verse 16 to 22 deals with Joseph. Speaking of God here, when he summoned a famine on the land and broke every staff of bread, he had a man ahead of them, Joseph, who was sold as a slave. His feet were hurt with fetters, his neck was put in a collar of iron, until what he had said came to pass. The word of the Lord tested him. The king sent and released him. The ruler of the people set him free. He made him lord of his house and ruler of all his possessions, to instruct his princes at his pleasure and to teach his elders wisdom. As I mentioned there in the psalm there of Joseph and his experiences there in Egypt. But once again, in this chapter, we see God working through the events of Joseph's life. And there's a few things to think about in connection with this. What parallels do you see between Joseph and Daniel? We made a number of references to Daniel during the lesson. How similarities do you see there between the experiences of both Joseph and Daniel? And how did Joseph's earlier experiences prepare him for his new role in Egypt, the things that had happened to him in Potiphar's house and in the prison as well? And then Joseph adopted Egyptian dress and appearance, and he took an Egyptian wife. So how was he able to maintain his faith in God without compromise in that land where many gods were being worshipped? How did Joseph keep his faith under those circumstances? A few things to think about there, and we shall stop and